Aliens assaulted a remote outpost, then discovered it was Earth's finest. The sensor array had been running its sweep cycle for 6 years without a single contact worth noting. And then, on a Tuesday morning in the 43rd month of my posting at Waypoint Kale, it screamed. Not a soft alarm, not a gentle ping. A hard, flat tone that filled the command room and did not stop until I pressed my palm against the confirmation panel. 17 thermal signatures, moving in a tight formation, bearing directly toward us at combat speed. I sat in my chair and looked at the screen for exactly 3 seconds. Then I opened the unit channel. All personnel to readiness. This is not a drill. I say again, this is not a drill. My name is Daniel Rowe. I am a sergeant major in the 9th Autonomous Contingency Group, a unit that does not officially exist, stationed at an outpost that is officially listed as a low-priority signals monitoring station staffed by a rotating crew of 8 technicians. That is what the file says. The file is wrong about almost everything. There are 22 of us at Waypoint Kale. None of us are technicians. Every one of us has spent the better part of a decade being trained for one specific type of operation. Sustained combat engagement with no reinforcements, no evacuation window, and no expectation of rescue within any useful time frame. We were selected for this posting because Command had looked at the regional threat map 3 years ago and drawn a quiet circle around a moon at the edge of contested space and decided that someone needed to be here when the circle filled with enemies. The circle was filling now. I pulled the formation data onto the secondary display and ran the classification sweep while my unit moved through the corridors below me. 17 ships was not a casual patrol. It was not a resource survey or a diplomatic convoy. The configuration was a standard Calvari assault package, 6 ships in orbital hold, 8 in a surface bombardment arc, and 3 configured as transport carriers. The transport carriers were the most important detail. They were not here to fire from orbit. They intended to land troops. Corporal Nathan Holt appeared in the doorway of the command room with his rifle already slung and his expression set in that calm, flat line I had come to read as focused readiness. 17, Sergeant Major. 17. How long? Just under 4 hours at current approach velocity. He nodded once, slowly, like a man hearing a weather forecast he had been expecting. I'll get the battery teams started on calibration. Do that. And tell Lieutenant Price I want her in here in 5 minutes. He left without another word. That was one of the things I had always appreciated about the people in this unit. Nobody panicked. Nobody asked questions that wasted time. We had drilled for this exact scenario 41 times over the past 3 years, and every person in this outpost knew their role so thoroughly that it had become something closer to instinct than procedure. I looked back at the screen. For hours, I did what I always did when the numbers were that serious. I started with what I knew and built outward from there. What I knew. The Calvari Dominion had been watching Waypoint Kale for years. Their long-range surveillance passes came on a 19-day cycle, and we had tracked everyone. What they saw on each pass was exactly what we had designed them to see. A modest energy signature from basic life support and sensor systems. A signal profile consistent with a standard monitoring station. No military hardware signature, because every piece of military hardware at this outpost had been built behind shielding that scattered its thermal output across a frequency range the Calvari sensors were not calibrated to read. We had spent 8 months getting the shielding right. A specialist named Corporal Ada Finch had spent 3 of those months arguing with Command about the power requirements, and she had won every argument, and the shielding had worked perfectly. What the Calvari believed they were sending 17 ships to destroy was a barely defended relay station whose most dangerous occupant was probably a communications officer with a sidearm. What they were actually sending 17 ships toward was a hardened military installation with 3 subterranean missile batteries, a fully calibrated point defense grid with interlocking fire coverage, a terrain denial minefield covering every viable landing approach within 2 kilometers, and 22 soldiers who had been waiting for this day since the first week of their posting. Lieutenant Claire Price arrived at 4 minutes and 50 seconds, which was within the margin I had come to expect from her. She was a compact woman with short dark hair and the kind of eyes that processed information quickly and completely. She stood beside me, and looked at the display without speaking for nearly 30 seconds. "They're coming in hot," she said finally. "Yes. Transport carriers. They want the station intact, or they want prisoners, or both. Most likely both. The intelligence value of capturing a human monitoring station would be significant from their perspective." She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "They're going to be disappointed." "They are. Battery teams will need 40 minutes for full calibration." "Holt said you already knew that." "I did. We have 3 hours and 50 minutes. Tell them to take 45 and do it right." She nodded and moved to the secondary console. I turned back to the main display and watched the 17 signatures crawl across the grid. For hours ago, if you had asked the Kelvari Dominion, they would have told you that Waypoint Kale was the easiest target in this sector. A skeleton crew, aging infrastructure, no strategic value worth protecting with serious force. They were wrong, and they were about to discover exactly how wrong in the most direct way possible. I pulled up the personal logs for each member of the unit, not to read them, but to see the timestamps. The most recent entry from every soldier had been written within the last 24 hours. That was standard practice here. You kept your log current because the mission parameters included the honest acknowledgement that not every person in this building would be alive at the end of an engagement. It was not morbid. It was professional. We had talked about it openly during the first month of our posting, and after that, it never needed to be discussed again. I opened my own log and added a single line. Contact at 0611 hours. 17 vessels, Kelvari configuration. The unit is ready. Then I closed the log, stood up from my chair, and walked to the window that looked out over the moon's surface. It was a gray and desolate place, all rock and shadow and thin atmosphere, with a sky that was always a particular shade of dark purple near the horizon. I had watched that horizon every morning for 3 years. I had watched the stars move across it during the long nights when sleep was difficult and the silence of the outpost pressed in from all directions. In 4 hours, that sky would be full of ships. I heard footsteps in the corridor, multiple sets, moving quickly, purposeful. Ada Finch's voice carried down from the lower level, running through a power sequencing check with her crew. Sergeant Owen Burke was in the armory below, and I could hear him directing the ammunition distribution with the efficient shorthand of a man who had done it many times. Private First Class Lydia Grant passed the command room doorway with a portable sensor unit under one arm and offered me a small nod as she went by. 22 people. For hours. I had read every military engagement report in our classified database that involved asymmetric force ratios. I had studied every account of small units holding positions against overwhelming numbers. The pattern that emerged from those studies was not what most people expected. The deciding factor was almost never equipment. It was almost never numerical strength. The deciding factor, in nearly every case, was preparation, the degree to which the defenders had anticipated the attack and arranged the battlefield to their advantage long before the first shot was fired. We had been preparing this battlefield for 3 years. The Kelvari did not know what they were walking toward. They had looked at the sensor data, reviewed the intelligence files, assigned a threat level, and committed a force they believed was more than sufficient. It was a logical decision based on the information available to them. The problem was that the information available to them was not real. I turned away from the window, walked back to the command console, and began the pre-engagement checklist. My hands moved through the sequence from memory, pressing panels and reading confirmations in the steady rhythm of a man who has rehearsed this until it no longer requires thought. Point defense grid, active and calibrated. Missile battery 1, armed and tracking. Missile battery 2, armed and tracking. Missile battery 3, armed and tracking. Terrain denial field, live. Communications array, passive monitoring mode, encrypted, recording all incoming traffic. I read each confirmation and felt something settle inside my chest. Not excitement, not fear, something quieter than either of those. It was the feeling I had learned to recognize over years of this work, the specific, solid clarity that arrives when a long period of waiting ends and the thing you have been preparing for becomes real and immediate and present. 17 ships. For hours. 22 of us. I looked at my unit through the internal camera feeds, watching them move through their preparations with the practiced ease of people doing exactly what they were trained to do, and I felt something the Kelvari would never have understood if I tried to explain it to them. Relief. We have been waiting for exactly this. The first transmission from the Kelvari fleet arrived 2 hours and 40 minutes into their approach. It came on an open channel, translated automatically by our system into flat, formal English, which was the communication standard in this sector. Waypoint KN installation. This is Fleet Commander Draven of the Kelvari Dominion 7th Expeditionary Force. You are ordered to cease all operations, secure your personnel, and prepare for immediate transfer to Kelvari custody. You have 30 seconds to acknowledge this transmission and confirm compliance. Failure to respond will be treated as an act of resistance and will result in the immediate commencement of surface bombardment operations. I listened to the translation. 30 seconds was not a negotiation. It was theater. I did not acknowledge the transmission. The 30 seconds passed. The first bombardment wave came in at an angle that should have been devastating. 8 ships, coordinated salvo, timed to impact within a 4-second window. It was a professional operation, precisely executed, designed to destroy the primary structure of the outpost before ground troops arrived to secure the remains. The point defense grid intercepted the first wave at 94% efficiency. 6 rounds made it through. 3 hit the outer surface of the installation at low angles and left craters in the rock. 2 impacted the secondary antenna cluster on the north ridge and destroyed it completely. 1 hit the perimeter wall of the western approach and blew a section of it outward in a cloud of gray dust. That was the extent of the damage. The Kelvari bombardment commanders would have been watching their impact telemetry and expecting to see a destroyed or severely damaged structure. Instead, they saw a structure that was largely intact and still radiating power signatures consistent with full operational status. I imagine the conversations happening on those 8 ships at that moment, and I did not imagine anything pleasant from the Kelvari perspective. Battery 1 fired. The targeting solution had been calculated 47 minutes before the first bombardment hit, based on the projected orbital positions of the Kelvari fleet at engagement time. Battery 1's round traveled in a precise arc and struck one of the 6 orbital hold ships along its port propulsion section. The explosion was visible from the surface, a bright, brief flare that expanded and then compressed into a dark cloud of venting gas and debris. One of the 6 orbital ships was now drifting. The bombardment stopped. There was a silence that lasted approximately 12 seconds. I watched the sensor display and tracked the fleet's response. The remaining ships adjusted their positions, pulling slightly outward, which was exactly what I expected. When something unexpected happens in an engagement, a professional commander creates space to think. Fleet Commander Draven was a professional. Battery 2, I said into the unit channel. Battery 2's round struck the propulsion array of one of the bombardment ships before the fleet's repositioning was complete. It was a smaller impact than the first, but the bombardment ship immediately dropped out of formation and began a controlled descent on emergency systems, which meant it was no longer a threat. 15 ships. Lieutenant Price's voice came through my earpiece from the lower operations room. Transport carriers have not changed course. They're continuing the insertion approach. I had expected this. The Kelvari military doctrine placed enormous emphasis on ground capture objectives. Even with 2 ships down, even with the bombardment halted, the transport carriers would follow through on their insertion orders unless they received a direct command from Fleet Command to abort. And Fleet Command was not going to issue that order. Not yet. The Fleet Commander had 17, now 15, ships against what his intelligence told him was a minimally defended station. The mathematics still favored him in his analysis. The mathematics were wrong, but he did not know that yet. Let them land, I said. Terrain denial field is active on all secondary approaches. They'll come in through the North Corridor or the Eastern Flat. North Corridor is more likely, Price said. The Eastern Flat has worse sensor coverage from orbit. They'll think it's safer. Agreed. Tell Sergeant Burke to concentrate the ground team on the eastern flat. The transport carriers made their descent over the next 20 minutes. They were careful about it. Proper approach angles, staggered landing patterns, troops deploying in covered formations. The Kelvari ground force was professional too. I watched them through the surface sensors as they moved away from the landing sites and began their approach toward the outpost. And I counted the signatures as the deployment completed. 214 troops. They moved in a broad formation with flanking elements extended, which was correct doctrine for approaching a fixed installation of unknown defensive strength. They had learned something from a bombardment failure. They were being careful. Corporal Holt's voice came onto the channel, calm and quiet. Ground teams in position, Sergeant Major. Awaiting your mark. I watched the sensor display. The Kelvari formation was 1 kilometer out. They were moving at a steady pace, maintaining discipline, scanning ahead with their own sensor equipment. At this range, they were probably picking up heat signatures from within the outpost and trying to count personnel. They would be getting confused readings because the thermal management system that Ada Finch had designed was still operating exactly as intended. 800 meters. They've stopped, Price said. I saw it on the display. The formation had halted. The lead element was probably reporting something inconsistent, a terrain feature that looked different from what the aerial survey had shown them, or a sensor reading that did not match expectations. The Kelvari formation commander was pausing to assess. 600 meters. They began moving again, more slowly now. The flanking elements had pulled in slightly, which meant the formation commander was consolidating in response to uncertain terrain. A reasonable decision. Also exactly what I needed him to do. Hull, ready. The terrain denial field activated across the eastern approach in a sequence that Burke's team had programmed based on 3 years of observing how Kelvari ground formations moved. It was not designed to destroy the entire force. It was designed to divide it, to cut the formation into pieces that could not support each other, to separate the flanking elements from the main body, to create chaos without creating a single, clear source of threat. It worked precisely as designed. The Kelvari formation fractured into 5 separate groups within 90 seconds. Communications between the groups became fragmented as the sensor interference component of the terrain denial field activated. The formation commander, wherever he was in that chaos, would be trying to re-establish contact with his elements and failing. My ground teams moved. 22 people is a small number when you say it plainly. But a highly trained soldier operating in terrain they know completely at night, with full knowledge of where every enemy is and where every covered approach leads, is not equivalent to a single point of combat power. They're something else entirely. They're a problem that cannot be solved by numbers alone. Over the next 2 hours, I listened to my unit work. Sergeant Burke's team moved through the eastern flat like shadows, using the terrain and the sensor interference to stay invisible while they reduced the isolated Kelvari groups one by one. Nathan Holt's team sealed the north corridor before the Kelvari could establish a rally point there, and then used the confined space to their complete advantage. Corporal Finch had left the defensive grid and taken a handheld sensor unit to the surface, and she was feeding real-time position data to every team through the channel, which meant my people always knew exactly where every Kelvari soldier was. The Kelvari ground force did not know where any of my people were. From the command room, I monitored both the surface engagement and the fleet activity above. The remaining 15 ships had moved to what appeared to be an assessment posture, orbiting at a distance greater than standard bombardment range, not committing to another salvo. Fleet Commander Draven was receiving reports from the ground force, and those reports were getting worse by the minute. I had the communications monitoring system recording every Kelvari transmission, and Lieutenant Price was feeding me summaries in real time. Ground force reporting heavy contact from unknown positions, she said. Formation Commander is requesting extraction for wounded. Fleet Command is telling him extraction is not possible at current threat level. What's the casualty estimate they're reporting upward? They're saying approximately 60 to 70% of ground strength is non-operational. I checked the timer. 122 minutes since the first bombardment wave. The Kelvari ground force had landed 214 troops and had lost the combat effectiveness of approximately 140 of them in just over 2 hours. My unit had not lost anyone. The fleet commander just went quiet on the channel for 11 seconds, Price said. I looked at the display. The 15 ships were still in assessment posture. What was the last thing he transmitted before the silence? A request for a casualty count from the ground force commander. I understood that silence. Fleet Commander Draven had requested a number, received a number, and spent 11 seconds doing the same calculation I had already done. When you send 214 troops against a target your intelligence rates as minimally defended, and you receive a report that 140 of them are no longer effective after 2 hours, you do not continue applying the same logic that brought you to that outcome. You stop. You recalculate. You ask yourself what you are actually fighting. The silence ended. Draven transmitted a new order to his fleet: pull back to maximum effective range and hold position. He had stopped thinking about taking the outpost. He had started thinking about whether leaving was still an option. The Kelvari ground force commander was a heavy-set officer with a wide jaw and pale, wide-set eyes that had seen enough combat to hold their expression steady even when the situation was genuinely bad. His name, according to the identification data we pulled from his personal communications unit when Burke's team brought him in, was Soren Vel. He had 2 small wounds, a cut across his forearm from rock debris and a pressure injury on his right leg from a fall during the chaos of the terrain denial activation. Neither was serious. Lydia Grant had dressed them in the Outpost's medical room without being asked, and when she was done, she had left him a sealed water container and said nothing. He sat in the observation room across from me with his hands loose on the table, not restrained, looking at me with the careful attention of someone reading a document in an unfamiliar language. I gave him a moment to settle. Then I said, "Are you comfortable enough to speak?" He considered the question as though it might be a trap. "I am." "Yes." "Good. I'm going to tell you what is happening and what will happen next, and I want you to listen completely before you respond. Can you do that?" He nodded. "Your ground force came down in 214 personnel. As of 40 minutes ago, the last count I have is 61 soldiers still in a condition to function. Those 61 are being held in a covered area on the eastern flat with food and water and shelter. They're not being harmed. The wounded among them have received field treatment from my personnel." Vel said nothing. He was listening. "Your fleet has 15 ships above us. 2 of those ships have significant damage and are not combat effective. The remaining 13 are sitting at maximum effective range, which tells me that Fleet Commander Draven has recognized that continuing the bombardment is not producing the result he expected. You have significant defensive capability," Vel said. His voice was measured, professional. "We have more than you were expecting." "Yes," a pause. "Considerably more." The fleet commander has transmitted 6 requests to Dominion Regional Command in the past 3 hours. I know this because we are reading your communications. Those requests were for reinforcement. The responses he has received have become progressively less supportive. The last response instructed him to hold position and await assessment. Vel's expression did not change, but something shifted slightly behind his eyes. "Regional Command is not sending more ships," I said. "They are reconsidering the strategic picture of this entire sector, because the transmission we broadcast 2 hours ago reached every receiver in the Dominion's regional frequency range." Vel looked at me carefully. "What transmission?" "A targeted broadcast on Kelvari military frequencies. It contained audio recordings of this installation's operational activity. Our technicians edited it carefully to suggest a force approximately 20 times the actual size of our unit, coordinating across a much wider area of operations than a single outpost." A long pause. "It was false. Entirely. But it was constructed from real recordings, and it was broadcast with our deep array transmitter, which as a ranger analyst will find difficult to reconcile with a Class 3 monitoring station." Vel looked at the table for a moment. He was processing. I gave him the time. "So Regional Command believes," he said slowly, "that this outpost is the edge of a much larger human military presence in this corridor. That is the most logical conclusion that would draw, yes." Another silence. Outside the observation room, I could hear the low hum of the Outpost systems, steady and undisturbed, and the faint sound of boot steps in the corridor as Corporal Holt ran a perimeter check. The Outpost was functioning. It was damaged in places, but it was functioning, and every system that mattered was operational. "How many of you are there?" Vel asked. I told him the number. He stared at me for a long time. "Say that again," he said. I repeated it. He sat back slowly in his chair and looked at the ceiling with an expression that was not quite disbelief and not quite understanding. Something in between, the expression of a man whose model of the world has just been revised in a way that requires him to reassemble several things simultaneously. 22, he said, to himself more than to me. Yes, against the 7th Expeditionary Force. Yes. He was quiet for a full minute. I let him be quiet. There was no advantage in rushing this particular conversation. "The breach on the eastern approach," he said finally. "The terrain was wrong. The survey showed clear ground. We modified the terrain 2 years ago. Buried the system in 3 stages over 8 months, so it would read as natural formation on any scan. The point defense grid. The signatures were completely masked. Yes, that took the longest to get right." Vel looked at me again, and this time the expression had settled into something more definite. It was not anger. It was not quite respect. That would come later, possibly. What was I recognized was recalibration. He was looking at me the way a chess player looks at a board after realizing the opponent had been 10 moves ahead the entire game. "What happens now?" he said. "Now I contact your fleet commander. I tell him what I've told you. And then I tell him what his options are. And if he refuses your terms?" I considered the question for a moment, not because I was uncertain of the answer, but because I wanted to give it the seriousness it deserved. "Then Battery 3 fires, and we reduce his fleet to 13 ships. Then 12, and so on. He has enough fuel to hold position for approximately 19 hours. I have enough ordnance to keep reducing his numbers for considerably longer than that." Vel was quiet again. "You planned for all of this?" "We planned for 17 ships. We got 17. It matched the model." The model. He repeated the word with a particular flatness, as though tasting it. "You modeled this engagement." "We modeled every possible variant of this engagement over 3 years. We ran simulations every week. We knew the Kelvari 7th Expeditionary Force's standard assault configuration from your published doctrine and from intelligence our side gathered over the past 4 years. We knew you would use a 3-carrier insertion. We knew the ground force size, the bombardment arc, the communication protocols." Vel closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked directly at me with a clarity that had not been there at the start of the conversation. "You wanted this attack to happen," he said. I said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He understood. I watched him understand. It moved across his face like a slow wave, and when it finished, he sat very still and very straight in his chair. "The 7th Expeditionary Force was not randomly selected," he said. "You knew we would be the unit assigned to this sector. We knew the 7th would be assigned to any action against Waypoint Kale if the Dominion decided to act. It was in the deployment rotation. So you allowed the intelligence picture to look exactly right. Weak enough to tempt action. Strategic enough to justify a major force. The intelligence picture did not look right," I said. "It was right. We built it over 6 years. Every scan your surveillance passed made revealed exactly what we had placed there for it to find." Vel made a sound that was not quite a word. He leaned forward and put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "You're going to contact Draven," he said. "Yes. And you wanted to speak with him. I would appreciate it if you were willing." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the outpost hummed. Somewhere in the lower level, I could hear Ada Finch running a systems check and narrating the readings to herself in a low voice, which was a habit of hers that nobody had ever asked her to stop because it was oddly reassuring. Corporal Holt appeared in the doorway and gave me a quiet look that said the channel was ready. I looked at Vel. "You have a few minutes to decide." He nodded once, slowly. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. I stood and walked to the doorway, and then I heard him speak behind me. 22, he said again. Not a question this time. A statement. The kind of man makes when he is writing something down inside himself, so he does not forget it. I did not turn around. I walked to the communications room and opened the channel to the Kelvari fleet. The line opened with the flat static hiss of a long-range military channel, and then Fleet Commander Draven's voice came through, clipped and controlled, with the particular tightness of a man who is maintaining professional calm through significant effort. This is an unauthorized use of a Kelvari military frequency. This is Waypoint Kale installation, I said, and is the frequency your ground force commander uses to speak with you. Ground Force Commander Vel is currently at this installation in good health. I would like to speak with you, and afterward I would like him to speak with you. I have a proposal for how this situation resolves. A pause. The line remained open. That was the important thing. It remained open. Speak, Draven said. I'm going to tell you exactly what this installation is, what happened to your ground force, and what your current strategic position looks like for where I am sitting. I will do this as efficiently as possible. Then I will tell you what I require from you. Then I will give you 30 minutes to decide. You are in no position to make demands of a Kelvari fleet commander. Fleet Commander Draven, I said, you have 15 ships, 2 of which are non-operational. You have a ground force that is 61 personnel from an original deployment of 214. You have received no reinforcement response from Regional Command, and you will not receive one, because Regional Command is currently in emergency session trying to determine how large the human military presence in this sector actually is. Your fuel reserves give you approximately 17 hours of station keeping capability at current distance, and the installation you came to destroy is fully operational. The line was quiet for 4 seconds. I am in an excellent position to make proposals, I said. I'm simply choosing to call them demands because that is an accurate description of what they are. Another silence. Longer this time. I had spent 3 years thinking about this moment. Not fantasizing about it, but thinking about it the way a builder thinks about the final load-bearing element of a structure. Every piece of the plan was designed to reach this point. The fleet reduced, the ground force neutralized, the Dominion's regional command in confusion, and one man on the other end of a channel with no good options and a limited window to act before his situation became actively worse. What are your demands? Draven said. The flat acceptance in his voice was not defeat. It was professionalism. I respected it. First, your 13 operational ships withdraw to minimum safe distance from this sector. I will specify the coordinates when we conclude. Second, the 61 surviving members of your ground force will be held at this installation in humane conditions until formal diplomatic contact is established between your government and mine. They will not be harmed. They will be fed and sheltered, and their wounded will continue to receive appropriate treatment. Third, you transmit, on a Kelvari military frequency audible to Regional Command, a full acknowledgement that the 7th Expeditionary Force conducted unauthorized offensive military action against a sovereign human installation at Waypoint Kale. The transmission must specify the date, the force involved, and the outcome. Another silence. The third requirement is not something I can agree to unilaterally, Draven said. Understand, which is why I said 30 minutes. Use those 30 minutes to consult with whoever you need to consult. But understand that the third requirement is the condition for the first 2. If you withdraw and transmit the acknowledgement, your ground force is treated as guests rather than prisoners and returned through diplomatic channels. If you do not, I begin reducing your fleet by 1 ship every 20 minutes, and we start this conversation again with worse numbers. I could hear his breathing through the channel. Measured, controlled, a professional trying to stay in that frame, even as the frame shook. I would like to speak with Ground Force Commander Vel, Draven said. He is available. 1 moment. I nodded to Nathan Holt, who was at the adjacent console. He walked to the observation room, and I heard him say something quiet to Vel. A few moments later, Vel entered the communications room and stood beside me, looking at the channel display. Draven, he said. Vel, report your status and the status of our personnel. Vel looked at me for a moment, not asking permission, assessing, reading me the way he had been reading me since he arrived in the observation room. And then he turned back to the channel. My personal status is uninjured. The ground personnel are accounted for. They are being held under conditions I would describe as appropriate. Treatment of our wounded has been adequate, he paused. Draven, I want to tell you something that is not in any report I will file officially. Speak. Do what he says. Exactly what he says. I have been in this installation for the past several hours. I have observed this unit. Do not test them again. The line was silent for a very long time. Understood, Draven said finally. Vel stepped back from the console. I took my position again. You have 30 minutes, Fleet Commander. The clock begins now. I closed the transmission channel and looked at Lieutenant Price, who was at the secondary console with a sensor feed running, tracking the fleet's movements in real time. She looked back at me with the expression of someone who had just watched something complicated become simple. He's going to agree, she said. Yes. Vel's statement pushed it. Vel's statement was the honest assessment of a professional who understood what he was looking at. Draven would have agreed without it, but Vel shortened the process. Price was quiet for a moment. Sergeant Rowe, she said, Battery 2's calibration is showing a minor drift. Ada wants authorization to run a correction cycle. Authorize it. She turned back to her console. That was the nature of this work, even in the minutes after the sharpest part of an engagement. The machinery kept running, and it needed attention. You could not let the moment pull you so far outside the practical that the practical fell apart behind you. I walked to the window again. The moon's surface was gray and still, the way it always was. The eastern flat, where Burke's team had done their work a few hours ago, was quiet now. The Calvari soldiers were in the covered area, held securely, mostly resting. A few of them were sitting upright, and from the window, I could see the small, still shapes of them in the half-light. Owen Burke came up from the lower level and stopped beside me. How are the prisoners? I said. Quiet. The ones who can walk, mostly sitting. Nobody's causing trouble. Grant is down there doing another round of wound checks. Good. Sergeant Major, he said after a pause. 17 ships. Yes. And we're standing here talking about wound checks. I looked at him. He was not quite smiling. Burke rarely smiled. But there was something in his expression that was close to it. That's the job, I said. Yes, it is. He looked out the window for a moment. Carla would have liked how this went. Private First Class Carla Marsh had been 26 years old. She had joined the unit 18 months into the posting, replacing a personnel transfer, and she had spent every week since then becoming exactly the kind of soldier this unit needed her to be. She had been at Battery 3's secondary control panel when an orbital round slipped the defense grid during the height of the bombardment, and the structural collapse had been faster than anyone could respond to. I had written her log entry myself, in the 7 minutes between the bombardment ending and the Calvari formation reaching the terrain denial zone, because the operational timeline required it. Yes, I said. She would have. Burke nodded and went back downstairs. 21 minutes later, the Calvari fleet began its withdrawal to the coordinates I had specified. At 28 minutes, Draven's acknowledgement transmission went out on the Calvari military frequency, formal, specific, and audible to every receiver in the regional command sector. Date, force designation, outcome. The language was careful and did not contain any phrasing that sounded like formal confession, which was what his diplomatic training required. But the content was unambiguous. The 7th Expeditionary Force had conducted offensive military action against a sovereign human installation at Waypoint Kale and had withdrawn. I listened to the transmission in full. Then I transmitted a 2-word confirmation to the fleet. Acknowledged. Withdraw. And that was the end of the engagement. I sat back down in the command chair and pulled up the damage assessment report that Ada Finch had compiled over the past 6 hours alongside her battery calibration work, because that was the kind of person she was. North Ridge Antenna Cluster. Destroyed. Replacement estimate 7 weeks. Western Perimeter Wall. Breached. Structural integrity reduced. Repair estimate 4 days. Battery 3 secondary control. Full replacement required. Timeline unknown pending supply request. For personnel with injuries of varying severity, all stable, none requiring evacuation. 1 fatality. I read Carla's name in the report, and then I held my hand flat on the console for a moment. 1 fatality. 21 operational. The Outpost standing. I submitted the after-action report to Earth Command on the Deep Array transmitter. It would reach them in 18 hours. I wrote it plainly, the engagement timeline, the force composition, the outcomes, the damage sustained, the personnel lost, the current status of the Kelvari prisoners and fleet. I made no dramatic statements. I used no language that implied anything beyond what had factually occurred. The facts were dramatic enough on their own. The diplomatic vessel arrived 11 days after the engagement. It was a neutral flag ship from the Independent Systems Council, the same organization that brokered most of the formal contact arrangements between human space and the various Dominion-aligned species in this region. It was a clean, white ship with no weapons visible on its hull, and it came in slowly on a declared approach vector that we had confirmed through 3 separate channels before we allowed it within sensor range. Ground Force Commander Vel had been at Waypoint Kale for those 11 days. I had spoken with him every morning, briefly, as part of the daily status check I did with all personnel under my responsibility, including the Kelvari survivors being held on the Eastern Flat. The first 2 days, our conversations had been functional. His needs, the needs of his people, logistical questions about the transfer arrangements. By the 5th day, they had become something slightly different. He was a man who observed carefully and thought carefully about what he observed. He had spent 11 days watching my unit function in normal operational mode, maintaining the outpost, running calibration cycles, conducting physical training in the early mornings on the surface, doing the unglamorous and continuous work of keeping a military installation operational. There was nothing to perform for him. We simply did what we did, and he watched it, and it appeared to affect him in some way he had not entirely processed by the time the diplomatic vessel arrived. On the morning the ship appeared on our long-range sensors, I went to the observation room, where he was having his morning meal, and told him it would arrive by midday. He set down his cup and looked at me. "You knew it would be 11 days, he said. "We estimated between 9 and 14. The Council moves at its own pace. The Council was already in contact with your side before the engagement." I said nothing. "This was planned," he said. "Not just the defense. The diplomatic sequence after. The acknowledgement transmission we were required to make. That was not a punitive condition. It was a document. It creates a formal record in the Council's archives. A permanent record of unauthorized offensive action against a human installation. Which means any future action against human installations in this sector requires the Dominion to either formally acknowledge escalating a documented pattern or to conduct its next action without authorization, which carries internal political consequences." He paused. "You said a legal and diplomatic foundation. The people who designed this mission said it. I implemented it." Vel sat with that for a moment. "How long ago was this planned?" "The mission structure, not just this outpost." "I don't have a complete answer to that question." "An honest answer?" "Yes." He was quiet. Through the small window in the observation room, the moon's surface stretched out in its usual gray stillness. Somewhere above it, the diplomatic vessel was descending. "Can I ask you something?" Vel said. "Yes." "Why conceal it? You clearly had the capability for a much more direct approach to this corridor. Why maintain the fiction of a monitoring station for 6 years? Why invite the attack rather than simply establish a visible deterrent?" I had thought about how to answer this question if he asked it. I had thought about it for 3 years, actually, because it was the question at the center of the entire mission. "A visible deterrent changes behavior incrementally," I said. "It pushes the problem sideways. The Dominion finds a different approach. Different sector. Different timeline. The underlying tension is still there. It just moves." I paused. This approach was different. We allowed the engagement to happen on a specific terrain, in a specific configuration, in a way that created a specific outcome that went into the Council's permanent record. Visible deterrence is a wall. This was a conclusion. Vel looked at me with that careful, reading expression he had worn since the first day. "A conclusion," he said. "The Dominion had been probing this corridor for 4 years. Small actions. Surveillance. Resource surveys in areas outside their claimed territory. Incremental steps that individually were too small to create a diplomatic incident, but cumulatively represented a pattern. We needed the pattern to reach a point where it created a measurable, documentable outcome that the council could point to. So you let us walk into it. You chose to walk into it. We made the door look open. Another silence, the longest of all the ones we had shared. Your side chose restraint, he said slowly. You could have established a real military presence here years ago and simply told us this was human space. Instead, you chose patience. You chose to let us commit the action that gave your side the legal and diplomatic standing. Yes. He exhaled slowly. Do you understand what that means from our perspective? I think so. It means you were not afraid of us. It means you could have acted at any point and chosen not to. It means the restraint was not weakness. It was calculation. He looked at me very directly. A species that restrains itself from using capability it clearly possesses because it is building toward a more complete resolution. That is a very different thing than a species that cannot fight back. Yes, I said. It is. He picked up his cup again and held it without drinking, turning it slowly. The Dominion will want to know what other outposts look like this one, he said. I would expect so. And they will not be able to confirm or deny the answer. No, they will not. He set the cup down. Sergeant Major Rowe, I'm going to say something that is not in any report I will file officially. In the same way that I told Draven to do what you said. I waited. I will recommend, personally and through every channel available to me, that the Dominion reconsider its posture toward human space entirely. Not because of the engagement, because of the 11 days after it. Because I have watched your people work. I have watched how you treat prisoners. I have watched how you maintain this installation. I have watched how you process the loss of your soldier. He paused. You are not what we thought you were. What did you think we were? A mid-tier species with moderate technological capability and significant political ambition. Manageable. Containable. Worth probing. And now, he looked at me for a long moment. You are something we do not have a category for, he said. And that is a much more significant problem than anything that happened in this engagement. The diplomatic vessel touched down on the designated landing pad at 1,342 hours. I walked Vel and the remaining Kelvari survivors to the transfer point personally. The council representatives were formal and efficient, as they always were, and the transfer processing took 40 minutes. Before Vel boarded the vessel, he turned and looked at me one final time. He said nothing. He did not need to. I watched the vessel lift and grow small against the dark purple of the moon's sky, and then it was gone. I walked back into the outpost. The corridors were the same as always. The same gray walls, the same low hum of machinery, the same smell of recycled air and metal. Lieutenant Price was at the main console running a routine systems check. Ada Finch was in the battery room with a diagnostic unit, still chasing the calibration drift that had been bothering her since the engagement. Owen Burke was in the gym with two other members of the unit, running the morning training cycle they had resumed 3 days after the engagement because there was no reason to stop. I went to the command room and sat in the chair and looked at the sensor display. The sky above us was clean. No formation signatures. No approach vectors. Nothing but the ordinary traffic of a contested corridor going about its business. The after-action report I had sent 18 hours after the engagement had reached Earth Command. I had received a 2-line acknowledgement. Mission parameters maintained. Proceed with standard operations. I had expected no more than that. I opened my personal log. The last entry was the one I had written on the morning of the engagement. Contact at 0611 hours. 17 vessels, Kelvari configuration. The unit is ready. I wrote the closing entry now. I wrote down every name, all 22 of us. I started with Carla Marsh because she deserved to be first, and I worked through the list alphabetically after her. Each name got 1 line, rank, name, status. 21 operational. 1 fatality. Then I wrote 1 more line. The outpost is standing. I closed the log and looked at the window. The moon's surface was gray and still and silent, the way it had been every morning for 3 years. The Kelvari were gone. The diplomatic record existed. The corridor was quieter now than it had been in 4 years, because something had shifted in the regional command structure that would not shift back quickly. Someone in Earth Command had looked at a map 3 years ago and drawn a quiet circle at the edge of contested space and decided that certain soldiers needed to be at the center of that circle when the time came. And they had chosen these 22 people because they were the ones whose names appeared on a list nobody talked about, a list that described what a human soldier was capable of when given time and terrain and purpose. I stood up from the chair. In the corridors of this outpost, 21 people were continuing to do exactly what they had been doing before 17 ships appeared on the sensor display. They were maintaining equipment, running calibrations, filling their logs, doing their training, eating their meals. They were doing what soldiers do when there is no immediate emergency. They prepared for the next one. Somewhere in the Calvari Dominion, Vel was writing his own report. Draven was writing his. Regional Command was in its second week of emergency sessions, trying to reconcile their intelligence picture of human space with the outcome of an engagement that should not have been possible. And somewhere in human space, in offices and planning rooms that I had never seen and never would, people who had drawn that quiet circle around this moon were reading my after-action report and making new circles on new maps. Because this was not one outpost. It had never been one outpost. It was the model. They came to erase a quiet little post at the edge of nobody's map. What they found instead was the answer to a question they should have asked a long time ago. Why had Earth never asked them to stop?